What is up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Fellow Show channel. My name is Kyle. In this video, we're going to talk about the 2023 Pittsburgh Steelers fantasy football outlook. And why I'm doing this is I actually have I have a radio show that reached out to me that they're located just outside of Pittsburgh on Wednesday night. I'm going to be joining them for about a 12-minute segment. So this is kind of just a way for me to practice going over what I'm going to talk about with them. But we're going to have fun with this. This is going to be a little bit shorter video. Again, I'm going to be doing a 12-minute segment on their airwaves, and I kind of wanted to kind of keep something similar to that with this video. So let's go ahead and talk about it. I guess at the top here, I did just list their free agency, people that they lost and they added. They did add a good amount of players. They did lose like Cameron Sutton, Spillane, Devin Bush, Terrell Edmonds. They did lose some key pieces on defense, but they also added a lot of guys here. You know, you got Patrick Peterson, you got Keanu Neal, Marcus Golden, Chandon Sullivan, a couple other guys down here, Nick Kwiatkowski. There's a lot of guys that they added in free agency. So I think their overall free agency, win-loss column is pretty neutral. But I did really like what they did in the draft this year. I thought they had a really good on both sides of the ball. But what we're going to do here is I want to talk about the offense last year. And keep in mind, like they go into the year with a rookie quarterback and Mitch Trubisky. And they still found a way to win 9 games. They actually ended the season pretty strongly. But let's look at this. So last year, they were 9th in plays per game at 65.2. 2021, they were 9th. 2020, they were 7th. So this is a team that does run, top 10 plays per game. I think that's going to continue this season. Now, for as many plays as they ran, they were just 26th in total points. So 308 total points, 18.12 per game. When you have a really good defense like Pittsburgh has, you can get away with this. But I do want to see more points per game this year. I think they got to get that over 20 and start winning some games with their offense and not so much on the defense side of things. So there's a little bit of inefficiency from last year. 9th in plays, 26th in total points. They were 23rd in total yards, about 322 per game. I do want to see that grow. I want to see that, up in the 350s maybe if we can, and then 28th in yards per play. So again, for a team that's running so many plays, the yards just aren't there. The points aren't there. 28th in yards per play at 4.9. Only 6 teams average under 5 yards per play, and the Steelers were one of them. So I did make a note. If they can get that up to 5.4 or 5.5 yards per play, they can be a top half of the league offense. So that's where I'm expecting them to kind of come in and make a jump. So, if they're just gaining a half a yard more per play, that's going to vault them from – essentially, they were a bottom 10 offense last year. Even if they're just half a yard per play better, that's going to move them to middle pack and a little bit beyond. So I like that option. They were 24th in passing yards, about 200 per game. That's too low in the modern NFL right now. That needs to be it needs to be in the 240s, 250s, I think. And then they did rank dead last in passing touchdowns. They only threw 12 touchdowns in 17 games, which is that's just not enough. I think Pickett only threw 7 touchdowns himself in about 12 full games here. So that needs to be that number. I'm looking for an improvement, and they almost need to double that number, if we're being honest. Now, the rushing department, they were fine in. They were 10th in rushing attempts with 500. They were 16th in rushing yards with a little over 2,000, 121 per game. And again, there's that just being 10th in attempts and 16th in rushing yards shows some inefficiencies here. They can be a little bit better at this area. They were 14th in rushing touchdowns, which was, 16th. And then they had 16 rushing touchdowns. And then they were 26th in yards per attempt. So that's what I'm talking about. So a team that's going to run the ball 10th most in the league, and for them to be 26th in yards per attempt, that's got to change. So there's inefficiencies in the rushing game and the passing game. And I think a lot of this stemmed from their poor offensive line play. But this year, their offensive line has actually done a kind of a 180. They are looking at, inserting a first-round pick here in Broderick Jones. They've also got some defensive help here, and Darnell Washington, who could help, blocking-wise. But Broderick Jones is going to come in and get a starting tackle job for them. That's going to help them right away. And then they also have a couple other improvements from players that I'm looking for. But PFF ranked them, I think, as the 12th best offensive line coming into the year. The last few years, they've been a bottom 5 offense. So if the offensive line's better, I'm expecting more rushing efficiency and then maybe even more deep ball attempts here. As they have more time to block, they can maybe get the field and stretch the field a little bit more. So that's kind of the recap from last year. They also had 19 total turnovers, which was the 5th fewest. So that's good, to run the 10th most plays and have the 5th fewest turnovers was pretty nice. And then Kenny Pickett's record last year, 7-5 when he played the full game. Trubisky was 2-3. Now, their record before the bye week last year, they were 2-6 through 8 games, and they only averaged 15 points per game. After the bye, 7-2, and they averaged 20.8 points per game. And that's kind of what I was talking about. If they can hit, 20 to 21 points per game, they're going to be a lot better team, and a lot like the team that finished 7-2 down the stretch. Now let's look at Kenny Pickett's numbers. He put up 145.9 fantasy points in 12 full games, 12.16 points per game. That was the 34th best quarterback points per game last year, which is not great by any means. But had he played all 17 games, averaging that 12.16 points per game, he'd have finished as the QB 18, which makes him a fringe, it makes him a super flex quarterback too, for sure. And he's currently being drafted as a QB 23 on best ball sites right now. So I do think there's a potential value for him, to be a success at his ADP. Looking at his numbers last year, he had 63% completion rate, 2,400 passing yards. He had the terrible 7 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. I'm fine with those interception numbers, but again, we need to get this touchdown number at least doubled from last year. And then he does offer a good amount of rushing upside with his legs, 55 attempts, 237 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And again, that was good for 12.16 points per game. On a points per game basis, again, that was 34th best. But if you extrapolated that out for a full season, and again, had he played full 17 season, he would have been the QB 18 on the year. So with that being said, my projections for him this year, and we can look at that in a separate spreadsheet if you wish, but for me, I have him playing about 16 to 17 games, throwing at 65% completion percentage, so that's going to move up a little bit there. His yards are at 3,900. He's got 20 passing touchdowns, 11 interceptions, and then I have him adding about 335 yards on the ground and 3 touchdowns, and I have him putting up a healthy 15.51 fantasy points per game. This would have put him as QB 13 in total points last year and a QB 19 in points per game. So I do think Kenny Pickett, again, he's not going to be a guy, especially if you're playing in a QB, it's a regular league that starts 1 QB, you're probably not going to put him, in your starting lineup too often. He might be a guy that you have to pick up off the waiver wire for a bye week or something like that. But I do believe in leagues where you can start 2 QBs, Kenny Pickett will be an asset. And I do think he's got potential to be a guy that, after a few games, we might be like, oh my God, he's actually playing pretty well. We could grab him as a backup. So I think there is brightness here for Kenny Pickett in year 2. Now let's look at Najee Harris. Last year, 13.4 points per game, RB14 on the year. His rookie year, of course, he was 17.7 points per game, and he was RB3. We're probably not going to see Najee Harris finish as RB3 anytime soon. You can see the major discrepancy here in the receptions department. Ben Roethlisberger dumped it off a ton, not so much last year. But I do have hope on Najee Harris. He's currently being drafted as RB12 on Underdog, which is half PPR. And Najee Harris, after the bye last year, which we noted the Steelers were 7-2 as a record, he averaged 15.33 points per game. He was RB11 in points per game and RB7 in total points, if we extrapolated that out. So I do think that he has the potential to be a top 12 running back this season. But I just want to note, too, down the stretch here, he did start losing targets to Jaylen Warren. He averaged 2.77 targets per game during the winning back half of the season, and he was averaging 3.5 targets per game in the first 8 games. So as the season went on, he got less work in the receiving game, still kept getting the volume as a runner, but I do want to note that some of his PPR value dipped a little bit. And again, he still was RB14, which, again, if the offensive line's better, if the passing game's better, there's going to be more scoring opportunities for Najee Harris. So I'm not out on Najee Harris by any means. I think he can be, again, for where he's being drafted, it kind of feels like hitting a single. Where, sure, I'm going to get some running back 1 weeks out of Najee when he scores touchdowns, but otherwise he's going to be 8 to 12 points most weeks here. He's not going to be a guy that is just mashing out these 20-point games every week. But I feel like in baseball terms, it's going to feel like hitting a single with Najee on your team this year. So I like him. But we got to talk about Jaylen Warren, because after the bye, Jaylen Warren, he averaged 6 carries, 2.38 targets per game, and he averaged 7.15 PPR points per game. So he was getting, roughly 8 to 9 touches per game. But then look at his last 4 games, the last 4 games of the year. And keep in mind, Najee Harris was still healthy and he was still playing well. Now, Warren got 8.75 carries per game, 2.5 targets per game, and averaged almost 9 PPR points per game. If we get that Jaylen Warren all year, that's going to limit Najee Harris's ceiling. So I just want to advise caution here. I like Najee Harris again. I view him as a running back too for fantasy football, but don't sleep on Jaylen Warren, because Warren, he's a guy that we can put on our bench. And he's a guy that I think if you know what hits the fan, you can whip him out there as a running back too, or a flex, and hope for these 10 touches per game. And who knows if that, maybe he gets, a few catches in that game and he gets you 7, 8, 9, 10 points. Otherwise, if Najee Harris goes down, Jaylen Warren is going to be a league-winning fantasy pick this year. He's currently being drafted as RB 44 with his ADP. But man, if he's averaging, again, the 7 to 9 fantasy points per game, like that could be really, really nice on your bench here. So I like Warren at ADP. I'm okay with Harris. Let's move on to Deontay Johnson real quick. Last year, 86 receptions, 147 targets, 882 yards, 10.26 yards per catch, and the big stinker was the 0 touchdowns. I think that's the first time someone had that many targets and 0 touchdowns. 2023, I'm projecting him for 97 catches, 152 targets, just over 1,000 yards, 5 touchdowns this year, and I got him, kind of smack dab in the middle of wide receiver 2 range, and that's full PPR points there. Now with George Pickens, Pickens had a pretty nice rookie year. He finished as wide receiver 39, and Deontay was wide receiver 32 last year. And the discrepancy that I found was in the points per target. Last year, Deontay Johnson got 1.2 fantasy points per target, and George Pickens got 1.96. So he's adding, almost 33% more fantasy points per target for George Pickens, because the dude only had 84 targets last year. Deontay had 147, and they basically were both wide receiver 3s. Like, there wasn't that much fantasy point differential between the two. So I think Pickens is a pretty good player to have on your rosters this year. I have him at 74 receptions, 122 targets, almost 1,100 yards, 6 touchdowns, 222 points, and he's my wide receiver 30 in a full PPR. So I think Deontay, wide receiver 2, George, wide receiver 3. Sign me up. I like both Steelers wide receivers this year. And then Pat Freiermuth, guys. Last year, he was the tight end 7 in 2022, 63 catches, 98 targets, 766 yards, 2 touchdowns, which is pretty low. I think he's going to beat that number significantly this year. He did average almost 10 fantasy points per game in full PPR, which was the 10th best points per game. But again, he still finished tight end 7. But the thing that I really liked here was he was 6th in targets, 6th in yards, and 6th in receptions. If those touchdowns, come up to maybe 5 or 6, and he retains all this reception, target, and yardage volume, dude might be a top 5, top 6 tight end this year. So I like Pat Freiermuth. He's a guy that I'm targeting. And that's pretty much it for fantasy football. We care about Pat. We care about the receivers, George Pickens and Deontay Johnson. We care about the running backs, Jaylen Warren, Najee Harris. And, of course, we care about Kenny Pickett. I do want to just shout out real quick. I'm going to be watching for it. I don't want to draft Allen Robinson, but we got to note he's going to be probably their slot receiver for a good amount this season. But then don't sleep on Calvin Austin III. I think he's a guy that they want to get worked into the offense this year after last year's kind of red shirt year. So I'm excited about the Steelers. I hope you guys are too. Let me know if you guys enjoyed this video, because it was kind of fun to look at it like a team by team preview when I typed that up today. So if you guys want to see another team, let me know in the comments. I can look into it and give you guys another team preview just like this. But that's going to do it for me. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you guys are new, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening. We'll see you in a future video. Peace.